Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Sam from the Barrington Area Library, and we are working on this program in conjunction with League of Women Voters of the Palatine Area. And I will resend the link to their website so you can learn more about them. We are very excited to have Audra Wilson with all her multiple qualifications with us today. And with that, I will hand things over to you, Audra. And as soon as I haven't seen your slides come through in my email yet, but as soon as they do, I will give you a hi sign and you can let me know when you're ready for me to make them live. So thank you so much for being here.
No worries. Thank you. I am. Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, good. My face looks frozen, so that's why I am having a little bit of technical difficulty. So I do apologize.
All been there.
Okay. All right, I'm going to try to open my slides and my notes. Everything is frozen right now, so we're going to wing this a little bit as I get myself situated, but as long as everyone can hear me. So good evening. It's great to see everyone, and thank you for being so patient as I'm navigating Zoom difficulties. Not a new thing for anybody, of course. I am the former executive director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois, as many of my leaguers know, and I'm sure that there are other folks from the community who are participating this evening. So I will presume nothing in terms of what people do or do not know about me, but I am very happy to be here and happy to have been asked to talk about women's suffrage and the role of Black women. Although what I will say is that I have my slide deck to talk a little bit about history, but I actually really want to do more about grounding this conversation in what's happening contemporarily, because, as leaguers, we love to know about history. We want to know founding and origins, and we love to get really deep into the weeds with things, which I think is a wonderful thing and a great trait for league members. But I think what's of even more significance is, why does that history matter? Why is it so important for us to understand from where we've come? How is that relevant contemporarily? So just talking about that context, obviously, we know that there is a huge election in just a few weeks. And make sure you still can hear me. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. My screen keeps freezing. We have a huge election in a few weeks. Probably, usually every election cycle, someone always says this is the most important election. You'll hear that. But I think in many ways, quite frankly, this is the most important election that we've had in modern history, because there is so much at stake. And not only is there so much at stake, it's been unprecedented in that we are experiencing things that we have never seen contemporarily from an administration. We are in the midst of a very, very challenging time right now with a dual pandemic. We are dealing with the ravages of COVID, and which unfortunately is persisting and does not seem to want to relent anytime soon. And that's combined with a period of pretty significant racial unrest. So these have been obviously dominating our conversations for the last 6 months. And that is why there's so much at stake in this upcoming election. So it's really important to think about that backdrop as we talk about kind of our history, not only as league members, but just the role or the omission of the roles that people played in the women's suffrage movement, and why you see that play out still today. That is just a little bit of some context for the conversation. And I apologize for not being able to access my slides as yet, because my computer is freezing. So you'll have to deal with my face for a moment. But I think whenever I would speak, when I would address league members and traveling around the state and talking about our history, for those of you league members who are participating, I mean, just to give that brief recap, we just celebrated 100 years of the founding of the League of Women Voters, which was founded at the Congress Hotel in Chicago on February 14th of 1920. And this is extraordinarily significant because founder Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a pivotal suffragist and founder of the organization. And so not only were we celebrating 100 years of our origins, it was also in the same year that we were able to celebrate on August 28th, the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So this is a huge, huge milestone. But one of the things that I always talk about when I speak to League members is that, you know, here we are this mighty political experiment that had now given 20 million women, or basically teaching 20 million women who now had the opportunity to be able to cast their ballots, guidance on how to do so. And that was extremely important responsibility for the League. But the reason why it's so important to have this conversation tonight is because sometimes when we think about the origins of the League, especially being women's suffrage and women's suffrage being born out of the abolitionist movement, it's really easy to get sort of lured into a false sense that you know, people of all walks, and specifically like racial and ethnic walks, or women of all racial and ethnic walks were in lockstep in pushing for suffrage. And that, you know, because it was a movement that was born out of the abolitionist movement, that there was this sort of place of this racial harmony. But the fact is, I am a big person that reminds people that you can't decontextualize history. It is really important to understand that notwithstanding the huge, huge contributions that were made by many, many women suffragists, pivotal leaders in the suffrage movement that we celebrate as League members, cannot extricate their history of racial subjugation because it's in lockstep with the history of women's suffrage. And we actually do ourselves a disservice when we try to separate out those histories, because what ends up happening is we really start to mitigate, or not even mitigate, just sort of minimize or erase the actual difficult parts of our history, the things that a lot of us don't like to talk about or don't like to acknowledge when it comes to the League. One of the things that I think I was proud about with being a League member and being executive director was the willingness of League members to really say, you know what, we have to embrace our history, because contemporarily, you know, we always talk about how we want to make sure that we are ensuring that every single person is able to exercise their right to vote, you know, this right to vote that was so long, hard and fought for. And we also want to make sure that, so like I said, every single person has the right to vote. We want to make sure that every single American has the ability that is able to vote to be able to do so. And we want to reach those communities where people have been most disenfranchised. But you have to be able to recognize our own history and our own complicity in this as we're trying to determine, as we're trying to identify those communities that have been most disenfranchised, and as we think about how do we reach out to them and what might actually be some of those impediments to us as an organization being able to reach out to those groups that have been most disenfranchised. So that's kind of how I always start my conversations with folks when it comes to talking about the role of Black women in the suffrage movement. If you give me 1 second, hopefully my notes should come up right now. Unless you're still being difficult. Just 1 second. I wrote some really good tidbits for this evening. That's why I'm trying to actually really pull these up. Not that I can't wing it, but you know, I wanted to give you some really good juicy stuff. But while that's still working its way out, here we go. Come on. Okay, so one of the things that we start to talk about is even thinking about the origins of the women's suffrage movement. Start by thinking about kind of the pioneers. Who are the people that we typically think of who are seen as being the pioneers of the suffrage movement? And there are many. I mean, it's not just 1 or 2 names, but we think of Susan Anthony, and Ray Stanton, Katie Stanton, excuse me. And so those are two large names, Lucretia Mott. I mean, we can go on, and these are folks who have been very closely identified with the movement, and they are pivotal folks in the movement. But what's important to understand is exactly what role that they played, even going back through Seneca Falls. Another huge supporter of the women's suffrage movement, a suffragist, was Frederick Douglass. Very significant because as a Black male, he was an actual ardent supporter of women's suffrage. And in many instances, when you speak to historians, has been credited for, quite frankly, being a pivotal reason why this women's suffrage movement began to gain the traction that it did. So it's interesting to think about that a Black male, you know, when you're talking about 1870, would play such an important part and role in the women's suffrage movement at such an early time. But you also have to recognize that there have been racial politics at play since the origins of the movement. The struggle that has happened in the women's suffrage movement has been, you know, if you're aligning women's suffrage with just general principles of equality, this is going to be a very hard sell. Not only are you talking about the individuals who have to reconcile their own feelings about race, because again, we're talking about 1870, so we cannot look at these things through a very contemporary lens. You have to think, you have to put yourself in the situation to understand, you know, who these actors are and the role that they're playing. So there has always been this sort of tension about, you know, if we are trying to make these gains when it comes to women's suffrage, knowing the legacy of slavery, knowing the legacy of Black people being, quite frankly, they were 3/5 of humans. And so this deep racism in the country, and how do you reconcile the two? And even to the extent that you had individuals who were pioneers in the abolitionist movement, you still had to fight contemporarily at that time against that prevailing sentiment. So even with the passage of the 15th Amendment that allowed Black males the right to vote, there was a lot of resistance within the women's suffrage movement there, because the concern was, you know, should Black males be allowed to be granted the right to vote before white females? And there were many of our pioneers within the movement that wrestled with this. And some, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had been vocal, unfortunately, in different settings about their concerns about the whether or not Black males should be granted that right to vote before white women. So it's interesting because I was teaching, actually I was talking to a bunch of students at Roosevelt University and having this discussion. And I was really amazed at just how many people, first of all, the limited knowledge they had, understanding about the origins of the 19th Amendment and the whole women's suffrage movement. So of course that was just an adventure trying to get everyone up to speed. But then to realize how sanitized, quite frankly, the version of women's suffrage had been for them. And they just knew there were a few pioneers and that was about it. Some discussions about suffragists versus suffragettes, the different types of, activism that was at play at the time, but really very little discussion about the role of other women of color. So not just Black women, but other women of color, and how important they were in this entire movement, and yet how their contributions were completely marginalized. These are individuals or students that didn't know much about them. And so I was even surprised in that setting, working with students and talking to professors, just how little that people actually knew. So it was interesting to be able to share the history of the League, especially having one of the pivotal members of pivotal suffragists, Carrie Chapman Catt, our own founder, and how she played into this. So for those who do not know, in case there are any non-League members who are participating or don't know this about our own history, Carrie Chapman Catt, again, another pivotal suffragist, had those own tensions, because you're dealing with a situation that in order to be able to convince white Southern voters that suffrage, or to convince it to grant the right of women to vote, Carrie Chapman Catt and others had to engage in a form of racial politicking. So the argument that had been put forth was that granting, and this is in the South, granting white women the right to vote would basically help to preserve white male hegemony, because you'd have now white males and white females that would have the right to both be able to vote as a bloc. Because remember, you're thinking of the times in the turn of the century, white women would typically be voting the way that their husbands would vote. So this could actually solidify or ensure that power block. And that was something, quite frankly, that was an argument that had been posited by even Carrie Chapman Catt. And that was very frequent to hear that sort of argument. And you have to also understand even just the reasons for white women wanting to vote and secure that vote versus Black women, for example. For Black women, this was a much more pragmatic, a more fundamental right to be able to vote. This was not symbolic. This was not just the ability to have the same right as their males, that to be on an equal setting. This was foundational for Black women who already, like Black men, were subjugated. They did not have full rights as American citizens, even though they were now free from slavery. So it was a much more fundamental reason why Black women wanted to be able to exercise that right to vote. And so even just the way that we approached voting was very, very different. But unfortunately, the only way that this is going to be able to happen, according to many historians, was that, because there was definitely tension within the movement. There were those who really felt as though, we should not be leaving, or we should not extricate the issues of racism and racial subjugation. We should be fighting for both. And yet there were others within the movement who said and recognized that may not be possible. We need to fight for one. And right now, the only way that we're going to be able to do this is to be able to play into this racial politicking. Now, when I started at the League, it was interesting because I would get into these discussions with people when they learned more about Carrie Chapman Catt. And, at some point, there were League members who really, as they learned more about the history and learned about, some of the, unfortunate things that that the founder did, and engaged in as it pertained to this racial politicking. And some really felt like the League needed to remove itself or sort of distance itself from its founder. And imagine me coming in as a Black executive director, and this is one of the first things that I was asked, like, well, what are your thoughts about that, Audra? And do you think as an organization we should distance ourselves? Because they felt like it was a very ignoble beginning for an organization that contemporarily is very much about ensuring that every single individual, particularly those who have been most disenfranchised, have the right to vote. And I think I would surprise people by my answer, where I said, absolutely not. You should absolutely not distance yourself from Carrie Chapman Catt, and you should absolutely not distance yourself from any other white female pioneer in the women's suffrage movement. I think, if anything, this is a great historical lesson and a great opportunity to ask ourselves, or not to ask ourselves, but to educate ourselves about, again, the inextricable link between racism and, in this case, sexism or discrimination against women. Yes, there are certainly parallels, and yes, there are certainly reasons why so many women of color banded with their white counterparts to push women's suffrage, and many examples of that collaboration. But it is also important for people to understand that that is just the grips still of racism in this country. And again, this you're talking about so recently after the abolition of slavery. So this is a great opportunity to be able to teach people just how complicated this issue is, because you still see this contemporarily, even after passage 100 years later of the 19th Amendment. And you saw that the passage on August 28th of 1920, it took another 65 years, or 45 years, excuse me, after the ratification of the 19th Amendment before the passage of the Voting Rights Amendment. So what you had in place was another 45 years of de jure, or legalized discrimination. And so the way this manifested itself were poll taxes, literacy tests, and other sort of mechanisms to make it constructively impossible for people to be able to cast, for Black people to be able to cast their ballots. So 45 years after passage of the 19th Amendment, before all people truly had the right to vote. And the way you still see those grips of racism is that we talk about the schemes that have been happening contemporarily, and these are the things that League members continue to fight against. We see kind of this constructive blocking of the right to vote when we're talking about these rampant accusations of voter fraud, even though at least 3 to 4 different administrations, both Republican and Democratic, that have done intensive studies to see, is there in fact rampant voter fraud? Is this something that we need to be concerned about? And time after time, in different administrations, Republican and Democrat, there has been no evidence found around elections of rampant voter fraud. And yet that continues to be posited as a reason why we have to put these constraints in place. So additional ID requirements and other sorts of things to protect the vote, when in actuality, there's been no proof of that. All different pundits have said that there has been no proof of any rampant voter fraud. We know that we've seen across the country all sorts of schemes that have been in place. So for example, and it's still happening today, I just heard it on the radio, as a matter of fact, I believe it was actually Florida, yes, because Florida actually just started with early voting today. And they had talked about the huge push to register more voters than ever, and yet about half of the polling precincts that had been opened from before are now closed. So imagine so the existing polling precincts are increasing by about 50%, which of course for COVID purposes is just a terrible thing to have so many people crammed into one place. But think about that though. Why in the world would you be closing polling places when the increase in the demand has gotten greater? And not to mention the fact that polling places are closing in areas that are more remote. They're closing in places, in communities that tend to be communities of color. So they're closing in places, for example, where people who, especially older residents who've had the ability to go just down the street to a school or something that's local now, have to go several miles away. It could be 15, 20 miles away. Whereas that's just the convenience that they had of being able to vote very close by in the local school or someplace like that is now gone. And some might just say, oh, it's just, that's just a situational thing. It's nothing insidious. But when you look across the country and you see the pattern of closing precincts and where they're being closed, particularly in communities that are communities of color, communities that have high voter turnout, and high voter turnout oftentimes for a particular party, it's then you start to say, is this just a coincidence, or is this something a bit more insidious? And that's just the stuff that's on the surface. There are all sorts of schemes that we've seen over the years that have been put in place, which is one of the biggest reasons why the Voting Rights Act has been so pivotal in ensuring and protecting the right to vote and protecting that right to vote for the most disenfranchised of voters. But now also what you're seeing is the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, slowly but surely, basically taking away its teeth, which is a very big concern for a lot of advocates as well. That states now can change these schemes. States that were the biggest offenders of trying to curtail that right to vote now are no longer being subjected to any sort of change in their voting and any new scheme that is put in place not being subjected to any sort of test or evaluation by a court. Now that they can change these schemes again under the auspices of curbing rampant voter fraud. But now, because the Voting Rights Act has been losing its teeth and its effectiveness, that you see, it's just like as soon as the decision came down, all of a sudden these schemes started to pop up across the country. This is what the League is continuing to fight for right now. But that is, again, going back to the history, why you cannot extricate racism and the legacy of racial subjugation from our history and from the history of voting rights. It is something that is unpleasant. It is something that doesn't sit very well with many of us as we think about this, but it is so important to understand its origins and understand that even our founders and even those who are pivotal in this movement, how they wrestled with this and how they unfortunately made a certain decision to say that if we were to for those, because not everyone had this moral dilemma, there were those who, quite frankly, were very much wanting to fight for rights for all women, and were not so willing to leave Black women by the wayside. However, by the movement just overall leaving Black women by the wayside and other women of color, this is what has set us back so many years, quite frankly, as it pertains to securing that right and really preserving that right to vote, an unfettered right to vote for all people. And so that's where we find ourselves today. And that's why I always say that it's important to understand where we've come from and to really put this, the omission of Black women into a more contemporary context. Now, there are other pioneers of the civil rights, of the voting rights movement and women's suffrage that we do like to laud. And we've been doing much more so as the League. So, for example, the contributions of Mary Church Terrell, and of course, a huge pioneer Ida B. Wells and her contributions. And so it feels good now to be able to celebrate and to acknowledge and to be able to celebrate. And it's something that I've also been very proud of, to see League members really want to learn more about and to embrace and to share these stories and to share this history, because again, I think it is extremely important. But again, we have to think about where we are today and where we're going to move as members, and whether you're a League member or not a League member, there is so much that's at stake. In addition to the schemes that we talked about that we've been seeing over the last couple of, actually, quite frankly, the schemes have been in place since not only since the passage of the 19th Amendment, but definitely since the passage, up until the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and still, although the Voting Rights Act was protecting people a little bit more. But what you're seeing today is very blatant, and in some ways, it's so blatant. And right before I left the League in May to start as the president and CEO of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, which is actually where I started my legal career. So in some ways it was like coming home. We are taking issues that are impacting disenfranchised communities and really putting them front and center so people understand what is at stake, why is it so important for people to be able to vote, and what are we really talking about that's at stake. But what really shocked me, I have to say, and I promise it's not me being political, I'm just stating a fact, is just how unabashed the administration has been about, no, we don't want as many people as possible to vote, because of the fear that if people were exercising their right to vote, everyone who could exercise their right to vote were to exercise their right to vote, that would work to the disadvantage of a particular political party. And when has that ever been an excuse to disenfranchise people and to do so blatantly? To now attack things like mail-in ballots, which again, another thing that has been cited as this is something that is rampant with fraud and it can easily be tampered with, and all of a sudden there's problems when, quite frankly, both parties have been able to take advantage of, well, not take advantage of, been able to use this system of mail-in ballots. This is nothing new. So why all of a sudden has this become this weapon, in today's discussion about who gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote, and preserving that right to vote? So it's kind of a scary time, quite frankly, to be having these conversations, to think that we could be so blatant and so brazen about trying to curtail that right to vote by putting out a lot of conjecture and myth, or trying to resurrect a lot of the conjecture and myth about voter fraud, to scare people into thinking that if we don't put these protections in place, that somehow our right to vote is being impeded. When we actually know for a fact that right to vote has been interfered with foreign interference, which quite frankly should be much more frightening to individuals to think that we can be cyber hacked and cyber terrorism. But yet we do have forces right now that are very actively trying to suppress that right to vote. So you do see this at play right now. And you see this at play at a time when, again, I said from the very beginning, there is so much at stake for the average voter. And so this is why the work of the League is so important right now. the work of, and whether you're a league member or non-league member, it is imperative that you be communicating with peers, your colleagues, anyone who will listen, to implore them to be voting, to make sure that as many people as possible, if they are not registered, that they should register and they should vote. And reminding people that voting is so important, because it's not just about, yes, I mean, obviously we have a high profile election. It's easy to look at the top of the ticket and see those who are, well, garnering a lot of the attention right now because they're sitting at the top of the ticket. But we also know very well that from the top to the bottom of the ticket, probably the bottom of the ticket in many ways is just as, if not more important, because these are the individuals who have much more direct control over our daily lives, or more influence over our daily lives. And so when I'm talking to folks about why it's so important to vote, and I have to remind them that, yes, notwithstanding all the things that you're hearing from commercials to this and that and debates, it is imperative that you exercise this right to vote, not only because people have fought and died for it, but that there is so much at stake for you at every level of government, and for you not to actually engage in this. But these are the conversations that we're trying to have with anyone who will listen, quite frankly. So I just say that to you, and again, I'm sorry that I don't have my fancy slides because I had some other kernels in there, but I just say that to you as part of this discussion, for you to really make sure that as we are trying to engage individuals, we let them know what is at stake. And one of the biggest things that's going to be important is for you to separate out that fact from fiction. I'll give you one example. One place that individuals have been able to take advantage, those who want to curtail that right to vote have been able to take advantage of, is myth or conjecture about whether returning citizens have that right to vote, and when that right to vote is restored for them, and taking advantage of that. And people who are, let's say, pretrial detention, and realizing that, until sentence, or that they still have a right to vote. Looking at different segments of the population that people would think would not be otherwise engaged, and very easy to convince folks that these are individuals who don't have the right to vote when they actually do. So these are some of the things that, as league members from across the state and across the country, are actually trying to tackle right now, to make sure that they are educating their peers about who can and cannot vote. But there's so many schemes that are still at place, and this is the reason why our work is more important than ever. I say our work because, though I'm no longer the executive director, I'm still a league member, and still very much believe in league values, and still try, even in my new capacity, still talk about that importance of voting, and why it's so important that every single individual cast that ballot. And and making sure not only that they're casting the ballot, but that the league and any other source that they have, they can really educate them about what does that mean to cast that ballot. Why am I casting the ballot for a certain individual? What does this person stand for? What are this person's values, backgrounds? It is so important, and that's why I love the league work. That's why I'm still proud to be a league member. And that's why I really, anytime I have a chance to really talk about the work of the organization, and our peers too, because again, you don't have to be a league member to believe in this. Although I'm always trying to recruit more members, but it is just, now I just can't underscore why it's such an important time to be able to talk about this. So what I want to do is because I'm trying to see if my camera will actually, I'm having trouble even just getting back to my main screen, but I'm going to try to see if I can see everyone's face. There we go. There we go. Sorry about that. But I really just want to see if there's, and Sojourner Truth, thank you. I saw a suffrage pioneer. Because I didn't have my slides in front of me. Like I said, I have my lovely laundry list of Black suffragists. But I did want to actually, whether it's a Q&A or sort of a discussion, open things up, because I really think it's important to have a discussion, if at all, about where we are in this moment right now, because there's just so much at stake, especially for communities of color. So the very communities that the League and other voting rights organizations have been looking at are under siege right now, quite frankly. COVID has exposed just how insidious structural racism has been. And COVID, as I said from the beginning of the conversation. And so that's why I say it's really important for us to think about, what is really at stake and why is it that voting is so important? Because we've just seen the effects of systemic racism. And this is not going away anytime soon. For those of you who read more recently, there was, I think, a New York Times article and another study that came out from the University of Chicago that has actually talked about how many more people have fallen into poverty since the first stimulus checks that have gone out, because now that there's no more economic stimulus for individuals, and income supports are constantly being challenged. And so now there are more people who are falling into poverty as a consequence of COVID, and of course, closing of businesses, loss of jobs. So this is just an example of the things that are at stake at this very second, which is why, I think it's important to have that front and center in any sort of discussion or dialogue we have. It's easy to get very mired into challenges with the administration, and certainly as we're getting close to Thanksgiving, and any sort of family discussion, we know that they can be very fraught. But I think it's also important, especially when I'm having discussions and speaking to different communities, to really talk more about issues and to let people understand, let the issues speak for themselves. And the fact that we are dealing with a pandemic that has impacted people from all walks of life, every racial background, every ethnic background, socioeconomic backgrounds. Unfortunately, COVID does not discriminate. And we've seen the impact that it's had on our economy. We've seen the devastating toll that it has taken on our family members, particularly those who've gotten very sick or who've lost their lives. And so this is certainly not something to be politicizing, but unfortunately it has been politicized. So oftentimes when I'm giving these conversations, I put that in the backdrop of things that are affecting us as a nation. And there are a few things that are affecting us so broadly as this current pandemic, and quite frankly, the pandemic that we've been dealing with, our racial unrest. But I do want to turn this back over to you too, just to facilitate that, because I'm sure people have some questions.
I'm gonna take the spotlight off, so it should go back and forth between you and I as we're speaking. And we did get a couple of questions that came up in chat. And so I think rather than trying to unmute people, there are 75 of us on the call. That could get a little rough. So, so I've just asked people to put their questions in chat, and I've gotten several already. So one of these, and this is a little more on the personal side, but so you may pass if you wish, but asks, how has your own life and work, both at League of Women Voters and at the Shriver Poverty Center? Tell me, it's Shriver Poverty and Law?
No, it's the Shriver Center on Poverty Law.
On Poverty Law, thank you. I had all the right words, just not the right word. How has your experience been influenced by the Black suffragettes, or what do you see? And hopefully we didn't just lose you. There you are. Oh, I think you accidentally muted yourself, Audra.
Here we go.
There you are.
Lost you for a second. Here we go. So that's a good question. I would say that, well, two things. I had more of an understanding of the role of not just Black women, but many women of color in the suffrage movement. Partially because not just my role with the League, but also from teaching. I taught Northwestern law for several years. So, that part of me kind of already was aware. So this was not a new thing for me. But I will say that what did bother me was that, notwithstanding my own personal knowledge, but that's because of my own research and background. Yes, it was frustrating to really, especially as executive director of the League, to really delve more into just that, how stark that omission really was. And to think that an organization that has been as pioneering as it has been, to think if it weren't also wrestling with just the history of racial subjugation, how much more impactful it could be. And so that, quite frankly, was what motivated me as executive director, because I have to say, as league members, one thing that I found very heartening was that, and I have to be very honest with you, I was a little worried, like, how am I going to scare people away? You know, how are people going to react to this? But actually, but league members were thirsty for this knowledge, and they were so ready to embrace and not apologize, because you don't apologize. It's history. This is what it is. You know, we're living today. You can't apologize for things from the past, all you, because you can embrace them and learn from them. And I was very pleased to meet so many league members that were so eager to learn from it and to embrace and to move it forward and apply it contemporarily. And that's what I thought was just so heartwarming for me. And I really felt good about that as executive director. I think sometimes the challenge is that it's how do you do that? How do you embrace? Not embrace, but how do you take what you've learned and move that forward? And that was something that I tried to do with members.
Sorry.
Can you hear me good? Okay. So Zoom. I'm glad you can't see the cartoon bubble over my head, because it would just have a lot of asterisks and other sort of things in there. I'm just like, argh. But that's something that I think I tried to do. I tried to now take the sort of excitement, enthusiasm from league members who want this knowledge and say, how do we apply this to the communities that we serve? Because many league members are in communities that are still somewhat homogenous, especially if you're outside of the metropolitan area. Or people would always ask me, but we're not sure, how do we make this sort of overture? How do we, you know, we want to be able to help, but we don't know kind of how to make an overture to different members of our community or people of color. And so I spent a lot of time talking to folks about that. I said, for example, do you understand, like, for example, if I'm speaking about the Black church is a very political place, extraordinarily political. So for those of you who haven't learned that, let me just tell you right now, this was the one place. It wasn't just a church and a house of worship. It was a place for ideas. It was a place for growth. It nurtured. I mean, obviously you see our civil rights icons, but this is a place to nurture political ideology. And so it has always been very, very active in the communities. And today, the Black church has been an integral part of registering people to vote, educating people, bringing candidates out. And so one of the things that I would say to some of my league members in areas where they didn't necessarily have these connections, I'm like, you know, you should do a little bit of reconnaissance, you know, learn some more about the churches in your communities, make an effort to reach out to them and meet them, and just, and not say, hey, we're the league and this is what we do, you know, we can do this for you, but just say, here's the work that we do, and we know that you're very central in your communities. Are there ways that we can partner and work together? And you'd be amazed. I met several league members who have been able to do that successfully.
And we had her freeze again. We will trust that she will unfreeze in a moment. Like, the baseball games are over. There isn't a debate tonight. I don't know why the internet is being so difficult. Audra, are you there? There you are.
I am.
Great. Oh, there you go.
Okay. But I was just saying that, you know, I would use this as opportunities to, you can get to know folks in your community. You can talk about the ways where there's synergy and to partner. And so, so some of my league members in Naperville, I know had done a lot of, and I mean, not just Naperville, but across the state, but I had a chance to speak to them too. And I found it really remarkable how they got to working with the local NAACP, in any other sort of community groups that are working specifically with communities of color, because the league has such a powerful reputation. And so there are a lot of groups who are, quite frankly, excited to be able to work with the league, work collaboratively. So there you go. Thanks, Ed. So, I would really encourage people to try to get to know them and talk to them. And I'm like, folks are willing, if you're willing to help and to engage, and people are willing to be engaged. And so, you know, but that's what I really love about the League. And I think that's why it's been so great for me that this journey and to be its first Black leader, because I really felt that people, I felt the sincerity and that genuineness, like saying, we want to do better. I've always said to people, I said, we cannot help the most disenfranchised if we continue to look as homogenous as we do as an organization. And I think a lot of people really took it to heart and have been, in their own way, shape, or form, trying to connect with communities with whom they'd had no direct relationship before. And even if you're living in a community that is still homogenous, so it's not for a lack of trying, but you're like, Audra, if there's 3% Black people in my community, what am I supposed to do? Point well taken. But it doesn't mean that you can't find some surrounding communities or other places to lend your wonderful League talents and efforts, and to say, hey, we might travel someplace else, or we will work with some other community groups to say, how can we, even though we're all the way over here, be helpful to you? So I really appreciated people trying to do that. And that just made my tenure at the League better. I kind of went off track with the answer, but I hope you get
all new helpful information to have. I have a couple, I'm going to try and push a couple of questions together, and hopefully we will get the gist of what people are asking.
Sure.
And this is specifically about young people and young women.
Yeah.
There is the kids are marching, right?
Yeah.
My kids are 26 and 24. One is living in rural Maine, but the other is in Washington, D.C. And he is out marching at least once a week, usually more. Are we seeing that translate into higher voter registration, more turnout at the polls? And this may not be information that you know off the top of your head, but if you do, we'd be interested to hear. Let me just make sure I picked up. I think that kind of picks up on all of the gems that were in there.
So in the Chicago area, and I'm only using Chicago because we're in a metropolitan area, a major metropolitan area. There are a lot of our peer voting organizations that, like the Chicago Votes, for example, that have been purposefully targeting younger voters, trying to engage younger voters, because when we look at voting patterns historically, they are probably most underrepresented in terms of who's coming out to vote. So it's interesting that they're most strident in their voices and loud and protesting, which I think is so extraordinarily important. But historically, we haven't seen that much of a translation into people actually coming out to vote. We know that folks who are older tend to be the most kind of the stalwarts of voting. I'd like to think it's changing. And when I would do a lot of forums with my peers from our colleague vote, our peer voting organizations, they're certainly trying to mobilize people, not just for registering folks to vote, but mobilizing them to vote and getting them more engaged in the process. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in this upcoming election too, because I think there's a lot more incentive and a lot more on the line. But when I spoke at Roosevelt University right before our 100th anniversary celebration. And I'm in a room full of people, most of them were under the age of 25. But I have to tell you, I was a little taken aback by how they just seem so removed from, they express their anxiety and their frustration, but they just seem sort of like, what's the point of voting? And it really sort of blew my mind, because this is where there are generational differences. Sometimes the problem with engaging younger people is that, because they make a lot of noise and because they're out there and they're passionate and they're strident, they're hoping that that's going to turn into instant action. And as most of the folks who are watching the Zoom know, that's just not how things work. I mean, to think if it took 100 years for women to be able to vote, if you're talking about decades of advocacy for people of color to be able to vote legally, And if you're just thinking how slow these wheels have turned for justice, then we understand that no, I mean, and it's not that these contributions aren't important, but we know it takes a long time. But I had to tell a lot of my, my younger audience, I said, listen, you get very frustrated because you're not getting instant results. And then you think that our efforts failed, and they don't understand that no, these movements take a long time. And people fight for years and years, and many people will never see, quite frankly, the fruits of their labor. They'll never see the benefits of all of their protesting and all of their agitation. I said, so you have to understand, we're agitating on all different levels. Some things might come faster, but you can't take I don't even call it a failure, but you can't take your agitation not resulting in immediate action as some sort of failing. It's not. It is necessary, but you have to put it in context. So I'm a really big person about history and historical context. And so I tell elite members, like, when you're talking to younger people and you're addressing audiences, you have to remind them that they're not doing this in vain. And you have to give them that context. Like, do you understand a lot of the gains that people that we've made as a society took decades, took movement after movement, it took aligning different movements. So quite frankly, you're at a stage where you're benefiting from the fruits of many people's labor, but that wasn't overnight. But again, when we remove context, then it's that's why people, I think, feel so disengaged, and younger people sometimes can feel like, well, not feeling the gratification, then is it really worth it? Should I even bother going out? And I have these conversations all the time with younger people.
Yeah. There's, when you were speaking earlier about the League of Women Voters founder, and should you try and, downplay that history and what her opinions were back in the day. If our readers aren't familiar, there's a book by James Lowen, Loewen, Lies My Teacher Told Me. And one of the main points that he makes is that by reducing history to only the story of the people who won in the short term, you erase exactly what you're talking about, that it takes time to make change in any direction. So yeah. And having said that, I'm not 100% positive that the library owns that book. It was published a while ago. I think our copy may have fallen apart, but I will check.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a question, and I'm going to just read this one verbatim from the person who sent it. So when I start, you're going to go, what? So the question is, as a Black woman, many of us are motivated based on the current political climate. However, there appears to be a great divide between Black, brown, and white women about being active in voting rights. How do we get all women on the same page? As a Black woman, my family members were free back in 1810. And for me, I would love to see others asking the questions about why this is so important for many of us. Understanding our varied histories is the start. How do we start?
Start again from, as a Black, my family was freed in 1810.
Yes, yeah. As a Black woman, many of us are motivated based on the current political climate. However, there appears to be a great divide between Black, brown, and white women about being active in voting rights. How do we get all women on the same page? I think is the first part, and then I can reread the second part. I think they're kind of linked, is that how do we get people on the same page? Okay.
So in a nutshell, and this, it kind of goes to what I was saying in the very beginning about why should it matter to anyone listening about this story of Black women's suffrage, or the role of Black women in the suffrage movement? Here's the deal. And this is something that's, I think, uncomfortable for when I talk to a lot of my colleagues and white female friends of mine. I was not uncomfortable. My friends definitely get this, but I can see why this might be a source of tension. We cannot talk about advancement of women generally without acknowledging that not all of us are starting at the same place. So we can aspire all as women because there are certain realities that we all share as women. I mean, yes, we all share many similar struggles, but again, you cannot extricate race from this conversation. And so you have to understand that no matter what your intentions are, no matter how much you believe in freedom and equality and every sort of wonderful ideal, that many of your colleagues peers who are women of color are dealing with an additional set of setbacks or challenges. So if we're talking about moving all women together and moving forward, you have to recognize that and acknowledge that. And I think that's sometimes where that tension is. So when women are talking, they're saying, well, it's great that you're talking about this. Yes, in theory, we believe in this, but please acknowledge that there are some other challenges that I have to deal with because I am, I am a woman, but I can't take away the fact that I'm a Black woman. Even just in not only in my role at the League, but my role now at the Shriver Center, I've had to endure, not from my own team or staff or anything like that, but sometimes unrealistic expectations that are placed on me because I'm suddenly supposed to be this the sage that can speak for all Black people or Black women. No, I don't. I have these wonderful magical powers, apparently because I'm a unicorn. No, I am not. It's just, I think people sometimes don't realize, and it's inadvertent in some places, but there's a lot of expectations and unrealistic that are placed on me, as a Black woman, that I'm thinking like, does anyone else have this challenge that they have to deal with? And that's frustrating, And so even the most well-intentioned people, and my big expression for those of you who've interacted with me personally, I always say inoculated by our good intentions. Don't say I meant well. It doesn't mean that offense wasn't committed. So you're not inoculated by your good intentions, and it's something that's really important to remember. Your colleagues of color, your peers of color, your friends of color have an additional burden. And so the way that you can truly be supportive and be a peer and ally is to not be afraid to acknowledge that and to recognize that I do have a privilege as a white woman. I have certain things spaces that I can walk in that others may not be able to easily. I think I just went out again. I'll be back.
I see you. You're good.
Oh, you still see me? Okay. There are other spaces that
No, now I can't see you. I will, while we're waiting for her to pop back on, a few people, there you are, Audra. A few people in chat have kind of made a similar point. So I just want to reinforce that the idea of intersectionality, that, to be poor and white is hard. To be poor and Black is harder.
Yes.
Poor and brown, that sort of thing. So
it's interesting when you say that. So here I am, the head of an anti-poverty organization. So we just had our virtual gala, and we had Dr. Ibram Kendi, who's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. So many of you might be reading that book. I see some fits there. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the creator of the 1619 Project, which, as you know, has been just getting completely, kind of dragged through the mud by the current administration. And for those who are not familiar, the 1619 Project essentially opines, what if we were to have our founding of the United States as at the date of 1619, when the first slaves came to the Americas, because obviously, they were indigenous people here, but came to what is now the Americas. So it's interesting because I just kind of lost my train of thought when I was telling you about that.
You were saying Ibram Kendi and I'm sorry, the 1619 Project.
With Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Yes.
I just suddenly got the point that I was trying to make. But hold on.
Maybe intersectionality, the poverty and intersectionality.
So they essentially talk about privilege, and hold on, I'm making my screen larger. And they do talk a lot about privilege, and that's something that I know a lot of us feel uncomfortable hearing and acknowledging, but it's the story of America. And you have colleagues who just simply by virtue of birth, this is a privilege that we don't enjoy. And so one of the best ways to, like I said, to be an ally or to be a peer is to acknowledge the fact that there is a privilege that white women may have that their counterparts do not have. Not to run away from it, not to listen, there's all sorts of privilege. We're all, Americans. I'm saying Americans just in general, whether because we're living here, not you don't have to be an actual naturalized citizen, but the ability to have light and internet when it's cooperating and water that you can turn on from your faucet. That's a privilege. That's a privilege that we all enjoy simply by virtue of living in this country. And so when you don't think of it in a racial term, then, people say, oh, I guess it is. So I can assert my privilege as an American. And I can assert my privilege as just the fact that I can sit here and talk to all of you and have a computer and have food and all these other things that so many of our counterparts across the country, that's a luxury. So I don't apologize for it, but I acknowledge it. I recognize it. I say, boy, I am fortunate to have this, but how do I use this privilege to benefit those who don't have it? And that's all when we talk about privilege, that's what's important. And in the context of voting, in the context of, especially with women and coalescing, it's understanding the fact that not all of us have the same privilege. And when you don't want to acknowledge that intersectionality of racism and discrimination against women, then that's the problem. And you lose out on an opportunity to say, hey, I do recognize that I do have some privilege that that my friend, my colleague does not have. How do I extend my privilege? How do I use my voice to call out the fact that there are others that don't have the same privilege that I do? That's the power that we all wield right now. And so I tell people, don't run away from it, but don't apologize. When I told you about the tension that League members had about wanting to disassociate themselves from Carrie Chapman Catt, one conversation was people actually said, "But we should issue an apology." And forgive my French, I was like, hell no, don't do that. Definitely don't do that. Because there was we should apologize. I said, you should absolutely not apologize. That's not what people are asking for. It doesn't absolve us as an organization by apologizing. I said, I think it sends the entire wrong message. And again, I think there are some people expecting me as a Black woman to have a different answer. I'm like, do not apologize for that. This is your history. You need to accept it. You need to embrace it and not run away from it. But you need to use this as a moment to be able to move the organization forward. And that's why I see so much promise for the League and just for League members, because I think they really do get that and are trying and struggling and are not afraid to have these conversations. So continue to read the book in your book club, continue to have these rousing discussions, continue to sit in discomfort for a minute, because just think about it for a second. I can code switch and I can go in different places, but I'm oftentimes the only one. I'm the only one in the room that looks like me. I'm the only one in an entire place that looks like me. And I'm carrying a lot of weight in my shoulders. It's just that I'm used to this right now, so I can navigate those spaces, but that's a lot to ask for people of color. It's a lot. And sometimes what you're seeing out in the street right now, when you're seeing people who are angry, and even in the unfortunate way of expressing it, what you're seeing is that frustration and that anger, and that just it's boiling over, that exhaustion, saying, I can't carry this burden anymore. And it's not mine to carry because I didn't create it. So don't look to me to have the answers. Right. I look to you, I'll work with you on how we move forward, but don't look to me to have the answers because I didn't create this situation.
Yes. There's a few things people have mentioned in chat that I just want to bring up is, and these are books that, again, I know the Barrington Library owns. So White Fragility, we actually have a number of copies in our ebook collection, in our physical book collection, and in our book club collection, where we buy multiple copies of one title you can check out. Cami wants me to mention that the Palatine League is holding a book discussion on Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And you can find that on the League lwvpalatinearea.org calendar. And I will link to that in just a moment in the chat. I will also say, for the folks on the call who are local to Barrington, there are several anti-racism efforts locally. One that's ongoing started a year and a half ago almost now, is Community Conversations, communityconversations.us. And they actually had Robin DeAngelo and a few other folks come in and speak. So there's some great information there. And one of the things that I learned, I don't want to say I learned the most from that, but just that keeping that curiosity. If you don't understand why people are angry, go read about it. You know, read more about the history, read more about what people are experiencing, and you will understand why people are angry.
You not only understand why they're angry, one reason why, and I saw some people who were kind of acknowledging that they've read Dr. Kendi's book. It's really important for everyone listening to understand that when he's talking about being being an anti-racist is an actual act. So the opposite of, so this is one thing I talk to people about, especially in my role at Shriver Center. And League members can sometimes fall into this. You see these extreme examples of Proud Boys and white supremacist groups and other things. And so they're just very obvious symbols that we can just reject and say that is horrible, it's abhorrent, it is not us. We deplore this, everything, we denounce this. But that doesn't make you an anti-racist. To be an anti-racist is an actual conscious act. It is an act. You're not just the opposite of that because you denounce that. And that's the essence of Dr. Kendi's book, which is something I would encourage everyone really to read, because it's actually talking about what does it mean to be an anti-racist and how do I affirmatively, practice anti-racism. And we have to understand that you can't be complacent. Denouncing something is just not enough. And so for League members, I think even before reading Dr. Kendi's book, it was something that I would try to encourage League members to do. I wasn't as articulate as he was about this, but to say that rejecting something is not enough. You need affirmative action to be able to show your allyship, to show that you believe in these principles. And that's so important. But a lot of people don't know how to do that. And especially, again, if you're living in a homogenous space or environment, you're like, what can I do to more affirmatively show, to be anti-racist? And these should be part of the discussions that people are having when they're reading these books, not just reading the principles, which I think is important, but have a discussion about what can we do in our community to act affirmatively to combat racism. So I encourage people to really read these books very carefully and to not. You might recognize parts of yourself in this, especially if you're reading White Fragility, but the only problem with White Fragility is I think people sort of internalize this and they're like, like the sword, I'm such a horrible person. And it's like, well, no, I mean, how do we move forward with this? Not to just to take all this in and just, you flog yourself for being like the worst person on the planet. That's not the point of this book. So I hope people don't certainly read that and feel that. How do I, now that I'm enlightened, what do I do with this enlightenment? How do I move this forward and act affirmatively, even if I don't have the opportunity to be surrounded by other kind of, colleagues of color? What can I still do even in my immediate surroundings and environment?
Yeah. One book that I found really useful as well is Layla F. Saad's, S-A-A-D, Me and White Supremacy. And it's a journaling exercise for 4 weeks. It asks you a question every day and it gives you some information, then asks you a question and asks you to journal on it every day for 28 days. And we actually did that as a book discussion at the library. Tomorrow night is our final night, wrapping that up. And she does a great job of encapsulating a lot of information and giving it to you in bite-sized chunks, and take a day and take this part in before you move on to the next. I like her work a lot. I know that there's, besides Courageous Conversations, Courageous Community, either Courageous Conversations or courageouscommunity.us will get you to the same site if you want more information about that. And the good thing about Zoom, despite our issues tonight, is that you don't have to be in Barrington to be able to join in those conversations. The Community Church of Barrington and St. Michael's Episcopal Church of Barrington are working together on a project. I think the easiest way to find more information about that is on Facebook. It's a very long title, Journey Towards Awareness and Understanding of Racism, something like that. If you go to either of those, Community Church of Barrington or St. Michael's Episcopal Church, you can get more information about that. And then I know that St. Anne's Catholic Church, I don't believe that their program has started yet, but I know I've met a few people who are getting training to facilitate a conversation about race and kind of looking at the perspective on that. There are a lot of opportunities out there if you want to learn to do better. You just got to seek them out. Last Wednesday, so 5 days ago, was our Parenting for Inclusion. And one of the things that I really liked that kind of, like you said, you read Robin DiAngelo and sometimes you're like, okay, I'm just not saying anything because I'm going to say it wrong, right? That's how I felt. One of the things that the woman who presented, Courtney Martin, presented last Wednesday, she's talked about doing the internal work and the external work together, right? That it's good to start internally and to start examining your own thoughts and things, but it can't just stay there.
No, it can't. But I think a lot of people, and sometimes I get frustrated because, like, with my new staff, I had to let them know, because I have like this huge gap of age. So we've got, Gen Zs and boomers, and I'm a Gen Xer, and, and millennials. And so we've got a very interesting mixture of individuals. But, unfortunately today, there's a lot of cancel culture. And these are folks who, and it's not just younger people that sometimes engage in it, but people think like, they're so quick to indict others if you say something wrong, if you, I guess I must be just getting mellower in my old age, but I'm thinking like, I'm listening to people's words and I'm trying to really just kind of discern their intentions. And so if you haven't had a lot of exposure, or if you don't know certain things, then yeah, we might make these sorts of gaffes. And one thing I had to tell my staff is like, we don't engage in cancel culture here. We seek out these learning opportunities. If someone is like, listen, when I had to listen to, and this is early in the year when our presidential candidate, so it was Vice President Biden, had made a comment about trying to talk about poverty and racism. And he said at this particular forum, he said, poor kids are just as smart as white kids. And I was like, oh my gosh, but and then he was just like excoriated. People were just like, and advocates, my colleagues, I would say, how could he say this, that, and the other? But I'm like, you know what? We need to be mindful of, before we're just blowing people apart. This is a perfect opportunity to engage in these conversations and understand kind of where people are coming from. We are in a society that is racist. All of us have been born and bred and raised in these societies. The difference is there are those of us who are aware of it, we embrace it, and we work actively to negate it. And then there are those who don't. That's really the only difference. And so, take an opportunity, because you might have people in your family, people in your community that have had very limited exposure or don't know any better. The minute we try to cancel them, then that's an opportunity lost to be able to see if you can at least get through to them. Some people not going to get through to. But I think that there are others, it's simply because they haven't been brought into a discussion to understand and exposed to other things to say, oh, I see why this might be offensive. I see the hurt that this might have. But I think it's an opportunity lost and quite frankly wasted when we're so quick to just take people out. And even for those individuals who consider themselves more liberal, I'm just using this in the non-political sense. I know where I am right now. But I remind them, like, you're just as quick to cancel as others. Don't be fooled, because if someone isn't as progressive as you are and as enlightened as you are, and how dare they say that, and we'll just cancel them. I'm like, no, I don't believe in that either. So in this day and age too, I implore people to really try to engage as best as possible in discussions with individuals. Again, COVID is a great backdrop. It's the only time I ever used the word COVID and great, but a great backdrop to say that it is so insidious that it cuts across all swaths. And so it's an unfortunate equalizer, but in that sense, you can say, listen, look at how this has ravaged our communities, but still look at the impact that it has in different communities. So it's kind of a great way to be able to have this conversation to show and highlight racism, for example, and inequity.
Yeah.
So I just, and as leaguers, um, folks are just will engage in these discussions with individuals, and please try not to just cancel folks where it's like, oh, you're not thinking like me and you're not as progressive in your thinking as I am, therefore we just should have no conversation.
Yeah, one of the things I'd urge people to do too is that just Google call out, call in culture. That, when is it most appropriate to pull someone aside and say, hey, I don't know if you realize that thing you said, da, da, da. When do you say it in front of other people? And when do you just say it publicly? Like, I don't agree with that, right? I don't want to neglect, there are a couple of questions, and I know some of these might be tough for you to have hard answers on. Speaking of COVID, do we have any idea what percentage of Illinois voting locations have closed due to COVID? And I would say there's both, early voting. I know there are fewer places than there were 4 years ago. And then election day polling places. Do you have any information on that?
Not right now. I know that, so when we were in our primary, and many folks on the call will know this, that polling places were being closed. Well, they're being closed left, right, and center for a lot of reasons. One was, right when the pandemic had just really surfaced, and especially for that were those in senior buildings or places where people were most vulnerable. Those were, a lot of folks wanted them moved out of their, of their areas because they were the most vulnerable. I'm not sure offhand of the number that were closed. Offhand, I mean, so, but I do know there were quite a few that were closed, and then others that were closed because, remember, we lost so many election judges initially, were folks who were scared, and it didn't help that the state wasn't they didn't put many protections in place, quite frankly, like just sanitation protections in place. And so people didn't want any part of that. So it would be interesting now to find out. And I know the Board of Elections would have that, to see how many places are actually now are open. Obviously, we know about our super sites and their other locations. Even though Illinois has been pushing very hard for a vote by mail, and this is yet another example of understanding the communities that we serve as a league. There are a lot of voters of color, and particularly Black voters, that quite frankly don't trust vote by mail. And this is not just in Illinois. And there is such just fear and anxiety and mistrust. And you can understand why, because all of us, hear this rhetoric that there are active campaigns to discourage voters from actually using vote by mail. Now I will say they're encouraging them to actually vote in person, but that is in play, and I've been hearing that quite a bit, quite frankly. As a matter of fact, I was on a radio program last week, and these are educated folks that are like, yeah, don't use those boxes, don't trust that. Like, it's almost conspiracy theories. They're like, nope, they're just trying to disenfranchise us even more. So, it'll be interesting, because I don't know how that contrasts with the number of sites that have actually been consolidated or closed across the country, or across the state. But I'm hoping that there have not been that many closed, because I do see a huge effort to get as many Illinoisans out to vote and letting them know where to vote and how to vote early. And there's still a record number of people who have now requested mail-in ballots. So I'm hoping that will, not have any negative impact. But I just want folks to know out there that there are some communities, especially as a league, if we're promoting mail-in ballots, that you're going to find a lot of communities of color that are not trusting that, and they're worried that their votes will not get counted.
Yeah, it's understandable. I know I live in Kane County. Our library actually covers 4 counties. So we're Lake, Cook, McHenry, and Kane. I know in Kane County, we did vote by mail, all 4 of us, and I can see that my ballot made it there. I can go to the Kane County election site and put in my last name and my house number and say, yep, we got yours in. So, but I understand the reluctance and, you know, long history of not being able to trust institutions to do right by you.
Yeah.
I have, it is past 8:30. I should point out it is 8:40. So for the folks who are still with us, I understand if you need to go. Audra, if you have a moment, I have one or two more questions for you.
Sure. I'll keep it short.
Thank you. And this is specifically about the league. I know the league has a goal to become more diverse. Now, I'm not sure, how long were you the president or president of the league in Illinois?
A year and 8 months, and 8 months, right up until May of this year.
Okay, so this may be a little bit of a, did you notice a difference in the diversity during the time that you were president? Did you see an increase in diversity?
I'm going to say not across the board, but partially we weren't measuring it in such a way to be able to tell, was there an appreciable gain? I mean, I can tell you there were a lot more efforts towards increasing diversity, and not just in terms of racial or ethnic, but also age, which has been a huge thing for the league. But we were not yet really measuring that. And one of the challenges that league is very, and this is my challenge, especially as an executive director, was the league, because local leagues have such autonomy in some ways, the decentralization sometimes made that very difficult, because we could say from the state level, we can be pushing and promoting diversity and efforts to diversify, but individual leagues would have, you know, some would be more aggressive than others. So you'd have leagues, for example, in the south suburbs that just were very reflective of the communities that they served. I mean, they really were almost half and half, let's say black and white. Age-wise, they weren't diverse, but racially, they had a lot more diversity. Then you'd see some efforts by other local leagues to diversify and work more in diverse communities. And then there were others that, quite frankly, were as homogenous as ever. And an interesting, when I first started at the league, I got an invitation from a local league, and it was inviting me to, what was it? It had decals and signs, and it said, invited me to come as executive director to party like it was 1818. And, you know, and it had pictures like wagon wheels and rag dolls and other things. And, you know, and this is like my second month there, and I was like, oh boy. So it was a little, you know, so, and, you know, but that's just how I know. I'm like, hey, listen, I don't cancel people. You know, these are educational opportunities. So, you know, I went out and the only reason why I'm pointing this out is because this is also a lead that talked to me like, we really want to attract more members of color, because I happened to be in a community that had a large immigrant population, a Middle Eastern population in particular. And so imagine I'm just getting to know the members and they're getting to know me, and I'm talking, but I have to have this difficult conversation to say, now listen, if you're really serious about wanting to reach out to different communities, we have to look from within. 1818, first of all, I'm not an Illinois native, so I would not have known that was the bicentennial of Illinois. And many Illinoisans, I'm not trying to say anything about history classes, but a lot of Illinoisans didn't catch that reference. But more importantly, you have just absolutely marginalized a whole swath of the community, because I wasn't partying in 1818. Okay, we were chattel. So, you know, it's just, you gotta, you know, and so like, oh, you know, not thinking about that. And again, that's why diversity is so important, because again, you're not inoculated by your good intentions. I don't purport to know how everyone feels, thinks, or whatever, because I don't have everyone's life experience. That's why you want to be in an environment where there are different kinds of folks that can give you different perspectives. And that's how we enrich and we learn from each other. But that was an example of like what some of the challenges that league members would have, not sort of thinking like, or having someone to bounce that off of, to say, this is the worst way you could possibly attract people of color, because it felt very tone deaf I mean, they knew that that certainly wasn't the intention, but the sentiment was it was very tone deaf. And it was, you know, if you really are trying to reach out to me, someone would have told you that that was not the way to do so. So I spent a lot of time, quite frankly, talking to different local leagues to say, let's just take a look again at how we approach people and frames of reference and that sort of thing. And again, people, I have to say, league members were so like, oh my gosh, you know, what can we do differently and how can we do it? So they, you know, they weren't defensive. They were actually apologetic, appropriately so in this case, and then saying, how do we learn from this and move forward? So I applaud members for doing that.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of the things we say frequently when we were all in the same office at the library was, you don't know what you don't know. That's why you need those voices there to say, you know, right, this might not be great. I think that covered many of the questions that we've got. I've got a bunch of people who said thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it. And that the work that you do just sounds incredible.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm so sorry for my technical difficulties. And when I get my system back, I'm still going to send you those awesome slides.
And I will be happy to share them. Yeah, I will share them to folks who are registered. And
I worked on them hard, folks. I really did. So I'm sorry for winging it a little bit, but I hope you're able to hear me speak from the heart and my love of the league and just our work is more important than ever. That's all I can say. Our work is more important than ever. And to be a 100-year-old organization that still keeps on trucking and doing this great work, it is a testament not only to our tenacity as an organization, but quite frankly, and the unfortunate part of it is that there's still such a need 100 years later. It's like our work is even more important today in many ways than ever, which is kind of sad to say after a century. But if that's just the inspiration and motivation that you need to keep doing what you do, then so be it. So I'm just so happy to have been its leader. I'm so happy to still be a member, and I'm still happy to extol the virtues of the league, even in my new role at the Shriver Center. So
thank you. I will give you a shout out that I just got a message from someone who is very involved in some of that anti-racist work I was talking about, who's like, I'm going to go become a league member right now. Yay! So good job. Thank you very much.
I promise I wasn't even trying to recruit actively, but
but as long as you're there, right?
Here, you know.
Well, and I think there's a lot of, you know, it's a good way to connect with people who are interested in these things. I threw a few links in there, one for Courageous Conversations, one for the Palatine League. Yes. And I think specifically if you go to that, Cami, educational programs is what will take people to the discussion that you're having.
We're both under programs and calendar. Okay. And under calendar, you can also find a link to a live virtual speech by the author of the Anti-Racist, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Kendi's going to be speaking live and virtually. So we have a link to that also.
That's great. He's awesome. He's awesome. And you'll love how he talks about, and I promise I'm not spoiling it for you. He even talks about how American racism, quite frankly, sets every American back. It's deep. Our racism is so powerful. It literally has dragged everybody down. So when you compare white people from Canada or different parts of Europe, and you're looking at indicators like universal health care or living wage or childcare and that sort of thing, that we are behind in all indicators because we are still so mired in racism and keeping others from having what we think we've got, that the irony is it has literally dragged all of us down as a country. And it's deep. So I'm excited, and I hope all of you are able to participate because you'll learn so much.
Well, we'll be waiting for your book, Audra.
No pressure or anything.
No pressure, no pressure.
Yeah, great.
My goodness, but thank you everybody.
Folks, thank you so much for being with us. And it will take a little bit of time, but we will get this up on the library's website. And I will send a link, and I will send, I keep wanting to say Dr. Wilson. I know you're a JD, but do not believe you're a PhD, correct?
And
So, go ahead.
you'll send it to the league also, correct? The
Absolutely.
recording. Thank you.
Absolutely.
We'll
Yeah.
post it also on our website.
Yeah. All right. All right, folks, thank you very much. Cami, if you can wait 1 second before
Sure.
you go.
Would
And
love
the rest
to.
of you, thank you so much for being with us. And we will let you go.
They don't want to leave.
I'm going to stop recording so it can